This email is from Carl. This is really good. Hope you guys enjoy this. I live in Williamsburg, Virginia. In 2009, after a layoff from the company where I had worked for 20 years, I got a job handling security in a historic plantation turned timeshare. Having a military former sworn security background, I was happy to get a job because I've always felt that work was better than unemployment. My former employer, the historic colonial capital of Virginia, suffered severe cutbacks due to a lag in tourism because of the economy. I had spent 12 of my 20 years there in security. A large part of that job was entering the historic original buildings in the wee hours of the night to make sure they had been properly secured and free of anything that might cause a fire, like a candle or a hot plate still switched on. There were many stories of hauntings coupled with a few creepy feelings that I had experienced during my inspections. So when I was interviewed for the job at the plantation, I was asked my feelings about haunted houses. My unvarnished response was, "Been there, done that." Management informed me that there was a ghostly presence called the Lady of the House, who was feared by most everyone who entered the place, and that after making sure no one was left inside, I would have to risk her displeasure in order to close the building each night. Since I had no trepidation toward being inside haunted structures in general, plus my experience with 300-year-old buildings and their previous unearthly occupants, I got the job. On the first night, I accompanied my training officer into the house to secure it. I was surprised to learn that all the lights were left on 24/7. They told others that the practice was done to make the house look more opulent, but I suspected it was for the benefit of the nervous staff and their arrested fear of the dark. My training officer had recited all the spooky tales that had struck fear into the hearts of the employees throughout the years. As we entered the building and started to the second floor, I initiated a make-believe conversation with the lady of the house. "Hello, lady of the house," I said. "Please allow me to introduce myself. I'm Carl, the new security officer, and it's nice to meet you." My training officer looked at me like I had lost my ever-loving mind. Well, I explained my reasoning. "It can't hurt to show some respect," I declared. "I'm sure I'm the only one who's ever done that." She affirmed that I was the only one, quote, "crazy enough to greet the woman," unquote. As we walked by the upstairs bathroom, the training officer noted that the light was off, and before her hand could flip the switch, it flicked back on. I thanked the lady of the house and bid her good night as we closed the front door behind us. For reference, there is an 18th century historic building in Williamsburg called the George Wythe House. Both it and the plantation were designed by the same architect, and the houses are almost identical with 2 stories and a large center staircase, flanked by 2 large rooms on either side. At the top of the stairs, the room on the left in the plantation is used for storage and features a bathroom with a modern door that unlocks when you exit the bathroom. This detail would become relevant later. Some months went by, and one day, as a visitor was leaving, she asked if I would like to see a weird picture that she took while inside the house. I answered her questions about the place being haunted, and I revealed several stories, including the one about the bathroom light. She showed me a photo on her digital camera that she took of the first floor fireplace, and standing in front of it appeared to be 3 translucent figures in colonial American clothing. One was a very regal-looking woman. I continued to serve in my security role, unafraid of the alleged spirits whose presence unnerved my fellow employees. And one night, as usual, I was making my rounds and preparing to lock up the place. Once I got to the second floor, I noticed the bathroom door was locked. As I mentioned earlier, this door unlocks when its user exits. I was concerned that someone may have had some disastrous encounter inside and might be unconscious or otherwise injured, so I began knocking hard on the door to get their attention. Without any response, I realized the spare door key was outside in my vehicle. I attempted to jimmy the lock with my pocket knife and even tried manipulating the mechanism with a credit card, but it didn't work. I turned to head down to my car to retrieve the key when I was struck with an idea. I stood at the top of the stairs and I pronounced loudly, "Lady of the house, will you please unlock the bathroom door for me?" If it didn't work, I would just be another foolish employee with a misguided belief in spirits. But I was thankful there was no one but me in the building to bear witness, one way or another. I went back to the bathroom. I reached for the handle and easily opened the door. After a quick inspection and finding no one inside, I stepped back into the hall. I opened and closed the door several times until I was assured it would remain unlocked. I walked over to the stairs and offered a heartfelt thank you to the lady of the house, and I locked up the building for the night. I don't think my coworkers believed my story, but unlike them, I never had a problem with locks or doors sticking. The secretary, who also doubles as a longtime historian of the place, informed me that the lady of the house must really be fond of me because she never extended such courtesy toward any other security officer before or since. Welcome to the Dixiecryptid podcast. I appreciate you. You just heard a really cool ghost story. We're about to jump into a Bigfoot story. Just want to stop the podcast for a minute and say, hey everybody, how's it going? All right, let's get to this Bigfoot story. All right, here we go. Here is another story from Illinois. The last podcast, well, one or two podcasts back, I did a story from a guy from Illinois. And here's another one. Right in the middle of the Shawnee National Forest in Illinois is an old churchyard complete with a cemetery containing grave markers of people who were killed by Indians. They used to put that information right on the headstones back then. Nearly 16 years ago, when we first started deer hunting that area, I'd bring our camper there and camp next to the dead. You'd think that would mean a peaceful night. I've heard a lot of people who live next to cemeteries say that they are the quietest and best neighborhoods to live in. Well, that wasn't the case for us. Every time we camped there, we'd all hear things running around in the middle of the night. Well, it must be ghosts from the cemetery, we always joked. And then one night, while we were all sitting around a campfire, we started hearing those noises a little earlier than normal. It sounded like they were coming from over by a pond that was close by. All conversation around the fire stopped as we all listened and tried to understand what we were hearing. When the sound started getting closer, one of my buddies leaned over to me and he said, "Well, it sounds like a bunch of kids are laughing over there." It was late enough in the evening that we considered it odd for kids to be in the woods playing in the dark. And then, as the sounds changed a little, he said, "No, I think maybe that's adults yelping and whooping and messing around." "Well, it must be someone from the other deer camps," I said. After all, we weren't the only ones out there. I don't think we said much after that. We were too interested in trying to identify the sounds. And when they got closer still, someone pointed out that it didn't sound quite human. When we heard the whistles, we all acknowledged that they sounded strange. Anyway, around 10 p.m., with an early morning ahead of us, we decided to call it a night and turned in. And after that, things got quiet for a while. And then we heard a loud whack that we were all startled out of our sleep from. No three men ever jumped out of their bed so quickly. "What is that?" one of my buddies hissed. There was nothing now. No more big bangs, no laughing children, no strange whistles. Just an eerie silence that left us all with an uneasy feeling in our guts. Finally I said, it's probably guys from one of the other camps playing a joke on us. Let's go back to sleep." I can't say that I believed my own words, but it was enough to get us all back into our beds that night. though it wasn't enough to give any of us a good night's sleep. At 5 o'clock the next morning, we ate our breakfast. We got ourselves ready and we each headed out to our own stands. Mine was 20 feet up an old oak tree by a pond, and as usual, I was in it way too early, so I took a nap. I didn't know it, but turkeys were roosting in the tree not 10 feet from me. I found that out when something woke them up and flushed them out of the tree, and it startled me so bad that I nearly fell out of my stand. I was still trying to reposition myself and regain my balance when I began to smell something putrid. It was like a dead dog soaked in a septic tank. Seconds later, the smell hit me and I heard the same strange whooping sound from the night before. This time it sounded like it was calling people in to eat, and it wasn't that far away. Well, I sat frozen in place, trying to pinpoint the exact location, when footsteps rustled through the leaf matter behind me. The steps were definitely bipedal, so it couldn't be a wolf or a coyote, and at the same time the smell and the weird whooping sound told me it wasn't a human either. I broke into a cold sweat when it walked right up behind my tree and it stopped. I wanted to turn around to see what was there, but I was afraid. I needed to know what I was up against, but panic shook my hands and rattled my brain. I couldn't make up my mind what I should do, what I had to do, and what I would do if I was attacked. Before I could make a decision, it stepped right out in front of me. Now, this thing was every bit of 9 feet tall, and it was covered in black hair. I sat there staring down at it as it stared down at the ground, apparently looking for a place to sit. While fight or flight are battling out in my chest, that ungodly thing planted itself under a tree directly in front of me. And then, with a dull thud, my cigarette lighter slipped out of my pocket and fell to the bottom of my deer stand. Well, the monster jumped straight up and began looking up into the trees around it in search of the source of the sound. It turned around and looked straight up into the tree that it had been sitting under, which put its back to me. "Please," I whispered, "don't turn around and look at me." I knew what I was looking at. I'd heard about these things and how they could tear a man to pieces if they wanted to, and I knew if it saw me, I would have no escape. As these thoughts raced through my mind and pushed my blood pressure to stroke levels, the Sasquatch slowly and deliberately turned and looked directly at me. And just for a second, I think I may have died. My heart quit beating and I quit breathing, and all thought left my mind except for one: don't look it square in the eye. Every possible scenario ran through my mind, all of them ending in my agonizing death. But do you know what this thing did? It smiled at me. At least that's how I interpreted it. Then it let out a howl that sounded different from the earlier whoops. I got the idea that it was telling the others that it had found someone here and to not come by. And with a little growl and what looked ridiculously like a wave of its hand, it walked away. Growing up in the 1970s in the small town of Monroe, Louisiana, you heard all kinds of stories about the history of the town and that region of northeast Louisiana. For a sleepy little town nestled in the curves of the Ouachita River bayous and swamps, you would never guess that it had been a place of habitation for several cultures going back nearly 6,000 years. My grandfather and his uncles would tell stories of things they encountered on hunting trips or working around the family farm, or that other relatives had experienced in the bayou and swamp country around Monroe. As a kid, I enjoyed all their stories, even if I didn't quite believe them, or I thought there might have been a bit of leg pulling going on. Some of the stories told to me growing up were from the Spanish and later American settlers, and also from the earlier Native American people. There were stories of giant, hairy, man-like creatures that lived in the deepest parts of the swamps, who did not tolerate trespassers, and they were beings who could change their shapes to look like other animals. Other stories were about people who would disappear out in those swamps with never a trace to be found. Of course, there were plenty of ghost stories around the old Garden District, and Monroe had more than its share of haunted houses. I experienced a few things in some of those 200-year-old homes that I can't explain, but those stories are for another time. In late 1975, I had my own close encounter with a Bigfoot out along the Ouachita River among those ancient Spanish moss-draped trees and waterways. My mom and I had gone on one of the periodic camping trips that our Baptist church put together for our congregation in the late summer of 1975. This particular camping trip was to Moon Lake, just north of Monroe. This area is adjacent to the Black Bayou National Wildlife Refuge, and that area has a long history of strange things happening and sightings of strange creatures. Our church used to camp at the lake for family weekend getaways and for some retreats. It was an old camp but was well maintained, so the main camp was clear and level but surrounded by old trees and bushes. Y'all, I'm sorry if my chickens are being loud. I've got my door open and they're out there raising sand. I don't know, I guess they're enjoying this warm weather, but let's carry on with the story. On this weekend, families had started arriving late Friday afternoon, with the rest coming in early Saturday morning to set up their tents and personal campsites within the larger camping area. As each family arrived, more of the kids I knew would be running around and playing tag or chase or hide and seek. As Saturday progressed, we moved to exploring the area outside of the campgrounds, which included skipping rocks across a slow-moving river, looking for arrowheads. We didn't find anything, but we had a grand time poking around in the soft soil, and we made a full day of it. At dusk, everyone was called in for dinner and visiting. While we were eating, we noticed the dogs some families had brought for the weekend were tracking around the campgrounds and occasionally whining. Since we were among the trees, more to the north and west, the setting sun made long and broken shadows between the trunks and hanging moss, which made it difficult to see what the dogs were reacting to. It did not make much impression at the time, and as soon as we finished eating, we ran back into the woods for an evening of hide and seek as it got darker. After about an hour, we went back and picked up some flashlights to continue our game, knowing our parents would eventually call us in for the night. And as we gathered back together and were talking at the edge of the clearing, a small stick was thrown into our group from the area just outside the lantern light. We thought it was one of the other kids, so we started trying to find them. We didn't see anyone, but every couple of minutes another stick would be thrown from the trees. Eventually, we started concentrating our flashlights in one beam and swinging them back and forth. We tried throwing sticks and small rocks back into the trees to see if we could flush whoever it was out, but we had no success. After about 10 minutes, we didn't see anything, and another stick came flying out of the trees, but this time it came from higher up, so we swung the flashlight beams up about 10 feet. At first we didn't see anything but a curtain of Spanish moss hanging from a branch close to the tree trunk, and then a face pushed out of the moss. Our first thought was one of the kids had climbed up the trunk, but as we looked more closely, the face was not entirely human. After a stunned few seconds, a body that was fully 10 to 11 feet tall and covered in shaggy brown hair stepped out from the tree trunk and moss less than 20 feet away. We started yelling and running back to the camp while whatever this was disappeared at a loping run back to the north. The adults had come running at our yelling, and after a hurried description, they took off in pursuit. They caught a few glimpses as the Bigfoot ran through the undergrowth and then dove into the river to make its escape. And when the adults came back to camp, every family packed up and left that night without another word being said about the events of that night. And for several years after that event, you would hear stories of strange happenings around Moon Lake area. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you guys on the next podcast. I appreciate you.